75 years ago, John W. Campbell started working for Astounding Stories. First as an assistant editor, is that right?
Yeah.
He worked under, what's his name, Tremaine?
F. Orland Tremaine.
Yeah. He started working as an assistant editor, and soon thereafter he assumed the full editorship of Astounding Stories, and soon thereafter ushered in the golden age of science fiction. And we have two astounding experts for you tonight. We have on your right Professor Garyn Roberts of, was it Michigan something?
Yeah.
He's at a university in Michigan.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name. And to your left is Ed Hulse, who is the editor of Blood and Thunder, and he also works for Pulpfest. They're going to tell you all about John and Astounding and the golden age of science fiction.
Alrighty, thank you, Mike. Hope you're all having a good time, and we hope we can keep you entertained for the rest of the evening and the rest of the weekend. We wanted to do this presentation because this year was a big anniversary year. Naturally, our main theme is we're celebrating the centennial of Edgar Rice Burroughs. As a secondary theme, we're celebrating the 80th anniversary of the first Conan story. And some months ago, I said, you know, there's another anniversary that we're missing, and that is the anniversary of John W. Campbell's ascendancy to the editorship of Astounding Stories, which later became Astounding Science Fiction and much later became Analog. Campbell, of course, was a very influential figure. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with his works. He started as a writer of science fiction. He broke into one of the Gernsback pulps in 1930, and he wrote for Astounding when it was first purchased by Street and Smith in late 1933 from the Clayton chain. Under Clayton, Astounding was pretty much a space opera type of book, was edited by Harry Bates, and had a lot of great writers in it: Jack Williamson, Clifford Simek, Edmund Hamilton, a lot of people who would come to be known in later years as masters of science fiction, although I don't think you could say that their early 30s works in Astounding were particularly classic in any way. But Campbell was kind of different. Campbell straddled the two extremes of science fiction. He was interested in stories of hard science, but not to the extent of Gernsback, who saw science fiction initially as more of a mechanism for teaching and less for entertainment. On the other hand, Campbell didn't go in for the kind of lurid, very pulpy space opera kind of stuff that typified the stories in the Clayton Astounding. In September 1937, as Mike mentioned, which was actually the last issue edited by Orland Tremaine, Campbell was signed that month and he took over the editorship. Now, there are some people who believe that Astounding's golden age begins a little later in the magazine's history, specifically around 1939 or 1940. One of these people is Alva Rogers, who wrote what I consider to be the definitive history of the magazine, called A Requiem for Astounding. Chances are somebody in the dealer's room has that book, and if you're interested in the magazine, I recommend that you get it. So what Garyn and I decided to do, we talked about doing formal presentations, and we talked about doing big panels, and we decided instead, let's just sit down, a couple of guys talking like Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel used to talk about movies, and we'll just talk about some of our favorite issues and stories and characters. And to get it started, I'm going to establish a premise. We'll see what Garyn thinks about this. I date the golden age, unlike Alva Rogers, who dates it very specifically and precisely with the July 1939 issue, which is important for reasons we'll mention when we get to it. I actually consider the golden age to have started earlier. I date it back to that last issue that Tremaine edited, the September 1937 issue, primarily because that has the first installment of Doc Smith's Galactic Patrol, which was I believe the first true Lensman story of the famous saga that he wrote about Kimball Kennison and the wearers of the lens, the Galactic Guardians. Doc Smith had previously written Triplanetary, which he kind of reworked later on into part of the Lensman series, but I believe it begins with Galactic Patrol. And like all of Doc Smith's stories, it's loaded with incredible ideas, some of which are scientifically plausible, others not so much. But it has a lot of space opera fun. It was not necessarily typical of what Astounding would become in just a few short years. But Garyn, I'll throw this to you. What do you think of the importance of Doc Smith to Astounding during this transitional period from Moreland Tremaine to Campbell, and the importance of the Lensman saga in general?
Sure. Thank you, Ed. We're going to agree on all kinds of stuff, and we'll disagree, and probably some of you will find me very opinionated on some matters, and that's okay, right? I'm not necessarily right or wrong. Doc Smith, of course, was one of the holdovers from the Gernsback era, as was Campbell himself. A very talented man. We know lots of things about his doctorate and about his background and his living on both coasts. And my favorite story about Doc Smith has nothing to do with science fiction, though. It has to do with donuts. I don't know if you've ever heard this story. Back in the depths of the Depression, there was a chain in Michigan, and forgive me for that, I know we're in Ohio, I've lived in Ohio too, called Dawn Donuts. I don't think the franchise is around anymore. It was around not too long ago. And in the depths of the Depression, the franchise came to Doc Smith, who was at that time living in Michigan, and they said, we need a chemist, which was Doc's background. And we need somebody to create the formula for the Dawn Donuts. And when $5,000 was good money in the depths of the Depression, Doc Smith created the formula for the Dawn Donuts that were in Michigan for some 60 years afterwards. Anyway, these guys were really, really something, obviously. Smith and thinking about guys like Williamson, who would later publish in Astounding, and of course Campbell, all that kind of thing. Most of us know the story of Gernsback, that wonderful story of him coming over in the early years of the 20th century, and his desire to market, of all things, batteries and radio equipment and that sort of thing. And he found, to make a long story short, that what would happen was that he could actually increase his catalog sales and things by providing articles and features that had some basis in science and even some stories, and this led him to all kinds of things, and of course the famous loss of his empire from Bernard McFadden and the copyright scandal and all that kind of stuff. So Gernsback, of course, Hugo's name for Gernsback, the fan award in science fiction, was quite a guy. And there's some interesting parallels. I guess I'm kind of backing up just a little bit here, Ed. Gernsback, as you know, had that famous icon on several of his magazines where he was struggling with this balance between fact and fiction in his magazines. And I'm all over the place jumping around, but it's okay. He fought with that, and he'd hired, as we know, and many of you know this as well as I do, scientists and military people, people who he felt would have some expertise in taking known fact and extending that into what could possibly happen, into fact-based fiction. And there was that icon, if you remember, on the early covers of Amazing Stories with the science fiction on the cover, where he was struggling with the term science fiction. Science fiction had been used, there were a variety of words, scientific romance and all that kind of stuff. And Sam Moskowitz would say that later it was one of Gernsback's publications that technically coined the term science fiction. But he was wrestling with that, and the reason I bring that up is because it seems that Campbell, when he took over, left Amazing and went to Astounding and all this, he was wrestling with the same thing, and I'm getting ahead of the story, but the result was in 1939, he realized the need for fantasy and he produced Unknown Stories. Gernsback had done something similar. This man who was so bent on science had decided to reprint Baron Munchausen stories and all kinds of wild fantasies that had very little to do with science fiction back at that time. So I didn't answer your question, and I don't even remember what it was, but
the importance or lack of Doc Smith and the Lensman series.
Well, it was great stuff. So that's kind of obvious, I guess. You read it today, and you have to look at so many of these pieces in a kind of a context, a cultural context, because some of his stuff can be kind of laborious. Some of it's very, very good. Some of it's wonderful space opera. And these guys, as we know, like Jack Williamson with his Legion of Space series, Legion of Time, and all those kinds of things, are directly referenced and utilized in later movies by Spielberg and Lucas, who, by the way, as we know, are big pulp collectors.
Right.
Yeah, so he was big. Doc was big, and he created the donut formula.
Right. I'm hungry already.
Yeah.
So my own opinion is that the publication of Galactic Patrol, which was serialized in 6 installments beginning in the September 1937 issue, and Astounding, of course, was a monthly magazine. My own feeling that was such a highly anticipated event among science fiction fans that it bought Campbell time. As somebody who was just coming into the magazine, he had a little time to experiment and to try and work up a formula and develop relationships with writers. Now, he maintained relationships and used frequently many of the writers that had been standbys of Tremaine's Astounding. But like I say, I think the importance of Galactic Patrol, above and beyond whatever merits it may have, and I agree 100% with Garyn, it is kind of laborious, and parts of it are just darn silly. But if you look at kind of the cosmic aspects of it, or let's say the macro aspects of it, the idea of this truly intergalactic struggle between good and evil, I mean really reduced to archetypal forms, and kind of layered over with science or pseudoscience, it really does kind of define what was going on. In early '38, Campbell introduced the first of his own innovations. Orland Tremaine, when he was editor, had a policy that he called thought variant, and he defined thought variant as stories that took what had been familiar science fictional situations in previous years and previous stories, and gave them a different twist, gave them an approach that had never been used before. Campbell in early 1938 did the same thing. He had his thought variant was called mutant. So he would talk about this is going to be a mutant story or a mutant issue, and he described them as, quote, genuine, fundamentally different, and original, unquote, stories. He also did something kind of edging away from the pulp realm. He continued astronomical covers. They became much more a feature of Astounding. The early ones painted by Howard V. Brown. These were not necessarily, I mean, those of us who collect pulp magazines, we know what the appeal of covers is. These were not necessarily designed to draw 12-year-old kids drooling over, two guys beating each other's brains out on a cover. But this typified Campbell's approach of trying to bring a little class to Astounding and the kind of fiction it was going to run. And it should be pointed out that by this time, Astounding had trimmed edges, which was very unusual for any pulp, and it was something the fans had insisted about. Now, Campbell doesn't get credit for that. Orland Tremaine did that himself. But one of the reasons that I think it's important to begin the golden age before that magical July 1939 date chosen by Albert Rogers is you missed the first appearances of a lot of great science fiction writers who Campbell either discovered or nurtured after they had sold one or two stories elsewhere. And just to give you a couple of examples, in the April 1938 issue, there was the first story by Lester Del Rey called The Faithful. And it was kind of a last man on earth story that involved thinking and talking animals and the last surviving humans' efforts to try and communicate with them. July 1938 saw the first science fiction story published by L. Ron Hubbard, which was called The Dangerous Dimension. Now, here's something, Garyn, that we can talk about. Hubbard, who up to this point had been writing largely adventure fiction, he cracked some big markets like Argosy and Adventure. He wrote for Dell's 5 novels monthly prolifically, but Dangerous Dimension was his first true science fiction story, and his first of a great many, not only for Astounding, but for other science fiction magazines. So, without getting too deep in the weeds on this particular story, how do you feel about the influence of Hubbard on Astounding? Do you think that he was as influential as has been claimed, or as has also been claimed, was he really just a hack whose later achievements, and I put achievements in quotes, kind of obscured the value of a lot of the stories he did for Campbell?
I'm not looking to take the middle road on this, but the answer is the middle road. He was very prolific. In my opinion, I'm not nearly the L. Ron Hubbard fan that a lot of people are. I have a moral dilemma we'll talk a little later with A.E. Van Vogt, because I absolutely love his fiction, but I have a problem separating personal life from some people with their... And so Hubbard has never been a big attraction to me. I found him to be very prolific and capable, nothing exceptional, but I wouldn't call him a hack writer either, so I would put him right in the middle and very prolific, and that's about what I'd say about him.
Well, I hate to agree with you because this isn't really, the Siskel Ebert formula, but I have to kind of feel the same way. Hubbard was a great natural storyteller. What he was not was a hard science guy of the mode that Campbell appreciated, nor was he a literary craftsman. See, the other great innovation of Campbell, and Garyn, tell me if you agree with this, Campbell believed there was a fusion possible. He believed that science fiction didn't have to be one or the other. It didn't have to be boring, dry, factual dissertation, and it didn't have to be crazy Captain Future space opera. That science fiction could be and would be, and he was truly visionary in believing this, a viable literary form all its own. And that solid craftsmanship and really good writing, really good storytelling, worthy of slick magazines, could be introduced in science fiction pulps. I happen to think that he brought that to Astounding. How do you feel about that?
I think you're absolutely right, and it's carried on throughout the format. Maybe a little later we'll talk about the bed sheets. You and I were emailing back and forth about those, and I did a little look into that about going from the standard pulp form to the bed sheet form for a little while there during 42 and 43, and then 6 issues back to the standard format, and then to the digest. And I thought, well, what is this all about? And again, maybe I'm off the topic a bit here, and I got to start complaining about Elspricht de Camp before we get much further.
Chronologically, this is a good place to do it because he was active at this point.
Apparently the word count in all those different formats was the same, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't know if there was if they thought that the bedside sheets saved paper during the war effort. Maybe it did, I don't know. Those copies they preserve pretty well, and they're fairly clean as pulp magazines. You can get pretty nice white copies still of them, and they're nice and trimmed, as you said. That was before Campbell. What was your question again?
We were talking about the importance of Hubbard and lack of same, and
Smith and those guys. It's very good. If you go back and look at those issues from 37 and 38, you can see right away with that last Tremaine issue and the cooperative work with, right away things are changing, and there's this nice synthesis of science, and there's this old feeling, I think, that I've read through the years, and maybe I'm wrong, that Campbell was kind of this hard-ass stickler kind of editor. And the more I read about him, I find that he maybe was more willing to think about things than people are willing to give him credit for. That he was willing to try a few things, and I wondered if the bedside sheet stuff was his effort, but it doesn't make any sense because Street and Smith at the same time was doing shadow manuals to look more like a slick magazine at the time and try to gain legitimacy by being the same kind of format. The paper's kind of nice, like I said.
And it also had to do with where the magazines were placed on the newsstand. By having them in the larger size, placed them with some of the slicks, and presumably got people to look at them who would not look at the magazine among the pulp size magazines.
Sure.
I want to get back to 1938-39 though before we get too deep into the bed sheets. The other thing, I think the point is arguable, but I think a very good case to be made that actually the most important story of 1938 was one of Campbell's own. He had written for many years as Don A. Stewart. And I guess he thought maybe when he assumed editorship of Astounding, it wouldn't look kosher for him to have a story under his own name. But the August 1938 issue, which otherwise is kind of a decent but unspectacular issue, has a truly classic science fiction story that belongs in any list of the Golden Age's finest achievements, and that is Campbell's, or rather Don A. Stewart's, Who Goes There? Now, a lot of you will probably know this better as the the basis for several movie versions of The Thing or The Thing from Another World. It is, of course, the story of the Antarctic expedition who's trapped. They find the body of an alien who is a shapeshifter and who moves among them. This was the kind of thing that Campbell was really looking for, and I dare say, without knowing it for a fact, that he probably either gave it to writers or an example, or some of his contributors used it as an example. Because in here, he used all kinds of classic techniques that were not necessarily germane to science fiction. He used suspense in a way that was unusual for science fiction. He used characterization in a way that was unusual. I mean, after all, the shape-shifting alien can duplicate a lot of things, but he can't duplicate the personalities exactly. So he can duplicate the appearance exactly. So Campbell played with a lot of things with this particular story, and it's truly one of the great achievements. I would also note, and this is pretty much kind of a note that would make more sense if we had the slideshow that we originally planned to run with this. February 1909 was the first Hubert Rogers cover. Now, Hubert Rogers was another of these journeyman pulp illustrators who'd done work for a lot of magazines, Argosy, Adventure, big magazines and small magazines alike. He was not, up until Campbell began using him in Astounding, known for his science fiction work. And yet he became to be a very important part of Astounding's appeal. There were other cover artists, of course, but Rogers, in the years 39, 40, 41, turned out tremendous covers of varying themes and with varying visual approaches and color schemes. And so his importance to these magazines is not to be underestimated. And those of you who may be collecting Astounding, as you go through the dealer's room this weekend, take a look at some of those 39, 40, and 41 issues very closely. You'll see some beautifully executed covers. I want to move into what is now considered to be the creme de la creme of the early Campbell years, and that is the year 1939. It began, of course, with stories like Jack Williamson's One Against the Legion, which is another kind of, I won't call it the last gasp of space opera in Astounding, but it marked the beginning of a transition away. Garyn mentioned the Jack Williamson Legion of Space trilogy began in 1934 under Tremaine's editorship. The last of the trilogy began in the April 1939 issue. And One Against the Legion, I think, was kind of important because one of the characters, for those of you who are not familiar with the series, it's kind of like an interstellar Three Musketeers with a D'Artagnan character kind of tacked on. But one of the musketeer types is a guy named Giles Habibula, who was a fan favorite of all these Williamson stories. And One Against the Legion really built his character up and alluded to a kind of a shadowy past that he had. He's kind of a Falstaffian character, you know, given to flowery language and you know, dramatic proclamations. But One Against the Legion kind of dipped in. And there again you see Campbell going beyond the typical space opera formula and digging deeper to find a little something extra. Now, is it all that successful? I don't know. How do you feel about that compared to the other ones?
I've got biases. It's very obvious. And Jack Williamson can do very little wrong with me. There's a lot of people, all writers are, I don't care which author you want to take, and this is my argument against elitism and trying to explain to people what pulp fiction really is. It's not Quentin Tarantino. All authors have highs and lows, and some of that the formula, the plan may have worn out a little bit. But, of course, he went on to do many, many wonderful things for another half century, including one of my all-time favorites. We recreated it for radio over in Dayton a few years ago with Folded Hands. And so that's really neat. 39, wow, what a year, huh? 39 is the year that the filmmakers usually, or the film historians point to, and they list them off, don't they? Gone with the Wind. I'm not an Academy Awards fan. I don't like political crap, and to me, that's nonsense. Wuthering Heights and Robin Hood and The Hound of the Baskervilles and Stagecoach, and 39 is like one of the great years in Hollywood, and they oftentimes, if they've got to narrow it to one, they narrow it there. But of course then in 39, in Astounding, you have about 3 months in a row You've got that famous issue with Van Vogt and the Black Destroyer. Asimov's second sale, but his first appearance in the Pulp's Trends. The next month, there's Robert Heinlein, who I like to describe as the Picasso of science fiction. He went through so many phases and colors and moods throughout his ultra-30s military beginnings to his wild flower child stuff before he died in the 80s, that he's just a fascinating character. I like the older stuff rather than the fantasy crap from years later. Crap, by the way, is a technical term. Academic jargon. Then after that, there's Ted Sturgeon. Of course, I never met Theodore Sturgeon. I'm not on a first-name basis. I shouldn't call him Ted, but that's what his friends called him. And that series of stories has been reprinted, of course, as we know, by North Atlantic Books. Wonderful, talented, quirky author from that period that went on for lots of stuff. You know, that famous issue with the monster on the cover of the Black Destroyer, the 1939 issue, that was reprinted by Southern Illinois University Press a number of years ago, and that's in facsimile, which is another one of my biases. I love the old illustrations and the errors and all. I like to see how it was out there. And but so many neat things, and all the stuff that's going on in '39, and after much protest and worldwide discontent with the United States is more than just financially backing the war. They're starting to physically get into the conflict now. If you go back and read microfilm from the 1930s, we were not real popular with the rest of the world because we seemed to be pretty pacifist in many ways if you read newspaper headlines. Anyway.
Well, I mean, and we'll find out very soon, because as you move from 1939 into 40, there are themes reflecting what was going on in the world in those days that creep into science fiction. And again, this is another part of Campbell's, I think, special talent. I'll stop short of calling it genius, but certainly he appreciated that you could work themes and you could work contemporary ideas and allusions to real-life events into science fiction, that it gave it a more realistic underpinning, and it also gave the authors a platform on which they could build allegorical stories. You know, by using things that were really happening, they could create future worlds that would depict the consequences of those actions, or different time streams, you know, coming from those actions. I just want to fill out what Garyn said. The specific stories he was talking about, Black Destroyer, which was A.E. Van Vo's first story, was another story that was very popular. It was not only imitated widely by other science fiction writers, but Van Vo himself did 3 or 4 variations of it. And it involves a kind of a cat-like alien creature who manages to sneak aboard a spaceship of humans and kind of wreak havoc there. I mean, you see this in cheesy movies like It, the Terror from Beyond Space. You see it even in echoes of it in Alien. So this kind of idea was, while not perhaps original with Van Vo, he gave it a spin that nobody had before, which is he told the story from the alien creature's point of view. And that was really important. That was in that July 39 issue. I also want to mention, as an aside very quickly, again going back to Campbell's desire to get fine writing and good craftsmanship, there's a story in that July 39 issue by C.L. Moore, who we know as Catherine Moore, who at that time was better known for her Weird Tales stories. Her story is called Greater Than Gods, and it's kind of an alternate future story, you know, where time could go in either direction based on actions that are taken. That was a favorite Campbell theme during this period, and his best writers all took a whack at it. Garyn, I mean, is it safe to say that Campbell, possibly alone among editors of science fiction authors in this period, was unique in not just passing on stories, whether or not they be published, but in suggesting themes to authors, and even going so far as to repeat ideas if he thought that different authors could come up with better spins on them? Or am I giving him too much credit?
Oh, I think you're exactly right, and I'm trying to be controversial, but no, I think you're absolutely right. His input and his ideas at that time were. Sometimes it's a matter of the timing too, the right individual at the right place, you know. But absolutely, I don't think he can be undercredited. You know, we use the term archetype quite a lot we think about literature and that kind of stuff. And an archetype is not necessarily the first. Say Sherlock Holmes was the archetype of detective fiction or detectives, but he wasn't the first, really. Astounding wasn't the first. That was amazing. But Astounding was the black mask of the science fiction. You know, that's probably an obvious statement. It's like Andrea Kramer at the Olympics asking the swimmers when they get out, is the water wet today? You know, she was obnoxious, wasn't she, at the Olympics? Anyway, yeah, Campbell was tops. And you know, there's a couple other stories about him that are very, very interesting. He apparently was the one, as the different readings I've done on C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner, and there's a lot of neat things about that collaboration, which each did and how they worked together and how they tried to synthesize who did what and sometimes didn't even want to tell who wrote what. He was apparently the one that brought them together and said, I'd like to see collaboration between you two, and there was a group of people, and he was. Now, we've missed Asimov, and Asimov to me is a lot like Heinlein. He goes through different periods. I like his early stuff. I love the Foundation stuff. Asimov, now I'll be controversial, like the camp was, of course, it's like me saying to the girl on the pommel horse, you messed up. Like I could do the pommel horse, right? He was kind of an ass, both were. And Asimov and the camp were their own greatest self-promoters. Asimov comes out with a definitive book on Shakespeare, sure, right? But that's not enough. He's got to come out with a definitive book on the Bible. That guy had an electric ego that would have made Tom Swift blush, you know. And de Camp was not very talented, and he was just a very nasty person in a lot of ways. I love what Glenn Lord said about him a couple of Pulp cons ago, and said he was one of the worst things that ever happened to Howard and Conan the Barbarian, he and Carter. And I think there's some,
that's a whole panel by itself.
Yeah, I think there's some legitimacy to that. Yeah. Anyway, but Campbell was great. He was tops. He was Thomas Jefferson of the early days, or whatever. Yeah.
We're running late already, so let's try and hit some high spots. I'm going to throw out a couple of titles. We just talked about some of the ideas and some of the contemporary references and the working in of real life themes into the stories. Another one that I think is a highlight from the February 40 issue, it's actually serialized, this is the first installment, Robert Heinlein's If This Goes On, where a dictatorship is kind of an outgrowth of a religious cult. And I think that in today's world, where there's a lot of skepticism about religion and the influence of religion in politics, regardless of where you stand on that issue, I think it's very interesting that science fiction anticipated a lot of the very same discussions that we're having now in our society. And I think that Heinlein, again, he was one of these guys. He probably had more ideas per square inch than any 10 other writers. Another one along the same, not along the same lines, but along topical lines. And I think this may arguably be L. Ron Hubbard's best novel-length story, certainly for Astounding. I mean, he did some great things for Unknown, like The Typewriter in the Sky and Fear. But I'm very partial to, maybe because I read it at the right age, Final Blackout, which starts in the April 1940 issue. That posits a Europe that's been devastated by decades of war, so much so, and over such a long period, that you actually have entire generations that have grown up at war. And this discusses, how events. Hubbard supposedly was influenced by the headlines in this story. And there was some controversy over, is this story really belong in a science fiction magazine, or is this just propaganda? I mean, how do you feel about Final Blackout?
I've never read the story.
Moving on.
Okay, yeah. I got something to say about war and that kind of stuff, though. Astounding went through an interesting period during the war years because some of its stable of Campbell's best authors ended up serving in the service. And that was an interesting challenge for Campbell. Another thing happened, and was that Astounding during the war years didn't get shipped over to Great Britain, and there was a great clamor for it. So when the war was over, Arthur C. Clarke and a number of other people finally got their subscriptions, and there was even stories of some of the pals, the writers who knew each other across the big pond, shipping issues and telling what was going on in Astounding because they couldn't get it in Great Britain there during the war years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And before we get to the war, I want to mention a couple of classics from late 1940. Of course, Van Vo's Slan, in which he finally moved away from the alien invaders kind of theme. And this is a Superman novel. But unlike previous Superman novels, it's a novel in which Supermen, or you might want to call them mutants along the line of X-Men, are actually persecuted by society. And this is the struggle of one of them who begins the story as a young boy named Johnny Cross, and his kind of saga of dealing with these tremendous powers that he has, telekinetic, I was going to say psychopathic. Well, you know, mind stuff.
Yeah.
Slan was incredibly serialized over the last 4 issues of 1940, tremendously influential in thinking that a Superman story didn't just have to be about, you know, guys who use their power either for unbridled good or unbridled evil, that there were layers of complexity there. And in the October 1940 issue, and I'll let Garyn weigh in on this if he wants to, another one of perhaps the key stories in Astounding's history, Harry Bates' Farewell to the Master. Now, you may or may not recognize the title of the story, but you'll certainly recognize the title of the movie that it was made into, which was called The Day the Earth Stood Still. Now, without going into the story's been anthologized many times, and you can probably read it if you haven't already, so I don't want to give anything away about it. I will say that as good as the movie, and I'm talking about the first Day the Earth Stood Still, we will not speak of the second one. But as good as that movie is, it completely misses the point and loses, quite deliberately, the final surprise of the story, which is one of the most remarkable last lines of a story in terms of impact. And I can just picture Campbell chortling as he read that manuscript and saying, "Boy, this will get him right where they."
And this is the same Harry Bates who was the earlier editor, right?
Harry Bates, editor during the Clayton period, and a writer with Desmond Hall of Astounding's first series character, a space opera character called Hawk Karse, who had a kind of interstellar Fu Manchu arch-villain, and they had 4 adventures in early Astounding. You would never guess that the guy who wrote the Hawk Karse stories would be capable of writing something like Farewell to the Master. So, Garyn, let's move on to 1941, which is another key year, a lot of great things. I think we should mention very quickly a couple of highlights. The story Liar, which I believe is in the January 41 issue, is another Isaac Asimov. It's the second of his robot stories, and it's the one that introduces the famous 3 laws of robotics, which I'm sure you all know, and if you don't know, you can ask us afterwards. In the July issue, beginning with that, Methuselah's Children, another Heinlein story, introduced Lazarus Long, who would come back. And then, of course, the September issue, a truly standout issue, with one of Asimov's best short stories, I think, Nightfall, which is the story about a planet that gets thrown into total eclipse every 2,000 years or so, and ordinarily the sun shines all the time. So when the planet goes into eclipse, the entire civilization falls apart, and every 2,000 years gets rebuilt, only to fall apart when the next eclipse comes. And Alfred Bester's Adam and No Eve. Bester, I think, really reached his full potential in the 50s when he was writing for Galaxy, with novels like The Demolished Man and The Star's My Destination. But this story is a really interesting story. It's one of these things where all life on Earth is destroyed tragically, and the last surviving man on Earth kind of goes nuts, and he's about to die, but he realizes that his death will cause a new cycle of life to begin. And it's a very poignant, very affecting story. I think this year, Garyn, in my view, this is the year of maturity. This is the year where Campbell's ideas, the seeds that he cast out in previous years, they're all blooming this year. How do you feel about that?
There certainly is an evolution from 37, where I think you see him right away, and some experimentation with some great success, and then a kind of a refinement, just as you say, in 41. And the list of authors you provide, Alfred Bester, wow, and on, and A.E. Van Vogt, who had an Arkham House book, right? George Slan was collected as an Arkham House book, and different variants of that story, and all these different authors. And then some of the old guys were coming back too, the Clifford Simacs, and it's great stuff. It gets you wanting to stay up late and read another astounding story.
Yeah, that's another great thing, I think, is that all through this period, Campbell continued to publish stories by some of the old-timers, the guys who went way back in the magazine, like Nat Shackner and Clifford Simak and even Williamson, who started very early. The fact that he was able to keep these guys not only with the magazine, but he moved them into these new directions along with these other later writers that he was grooming. So it was at the end of 1941, with the issue cover dated January 42, that Astounding went into its bedsheet phase, which lasted another 13 or 14 issues. So Garyn, what do you think from that period? What strikes you as some of the best stuff from that period, or the directions the magazine?
Well, there's some more C.L. Moore stuff. She and Henry Kuttner had done a number of things together, and a lot of things she was the mastermind, and other things like the Gallagher stories, the robot stories. He was the primary guy behind it. There were a number of British authors too. The two that stand out, of course, are Eric Frank Russell, who apparently in real life was a bit of an eccentric, but really neat stories. I love his stuff. And a very prolific and also very talented John Russell Farren from that period. So that's neat. We get some British science fiction, which we're generalizing here, but there's a difference. There's a kind of a subtle difference. And of course,
what would you say that is?
Oh boy, I don't know. Sometimes you have a taste for one, and sometimes you have a taste for the other. I don't know if it's drier or cleaner sometimes in British stuff. Their monsters are more fun, or it's just different. So I didn't answer your question at all, but sometimes I like to read British science fiction, sometimes I like to read American stuff. There was a guy who's been collected in hardcover too, Cleve Cartmill, talented author. Just a who's who, a list of really neat authors.
Now, jumping ahead a little bit, it was Cartmill who figured in a very interesting story with Campbell during the war involving certain things the government was working on. Remember that?
I don't know that story.
Oh.
No.
Do I have this right? Isn't it Cartmill and maybe somebody who wrote Deadline or Deadfall, is it, about a little thing that scientists were working on called the atomic bomb. And when the issue came out in 1944, long before Hiroshima, some government people thought it rather odd that this Pulp magazine got it so close to right, and Campbell was paid a visit by the FBI and had some explaining to do. Anyway, to get back to very quickly to the bedsheet phase, didn't the Foundation series begin during that period also, Asimov's Foundation series? He certainly milked that.
It's right around that time. I don't know the exact year. 41 sounds about right in the bedsheet stuff. I'm struck, too, by how many of these, of course, Galaxy would do really well with this in the next phase of science fiction magazines, but how many of them made really neat radio programs for Dimension X, X-1, Escape. Nightfall is done really well on radio with Folded Hands. A lot of early astounding stories are done, and then, of course, they move into Galaxy, and you get Alfred Bester, who not only did Pulp, he wrote radio scripts for Superman and all that stuff. He did comic book writing and scripting, and he was quite a talented, versatile guy. Yeah.
I think the bedsheet period was very interesting for Astounding. There's probably a lot more there. One thing we should mention, you also see during this period the flowering of the collaboration between Henry Kuttner and his wife Catherine Moore, who wrote also as Lewis Paget. And they were also writing for Campbell's companion magazine, Unknown, which, is, as we mentioned before, was a fantasy magazine. There again, Campbell's, and I hesitate to call it genius, but his talent, his gift for getting the best out of authors, when guys came to him with ideas, and he said, this is not right for Astounding, but it is right for Unknown. He was really great at that, and I would put Unknown really right alongside the golden age of Astounding as being top top writing. You get a few clinkers here and there, some stories that aren't quite as better than others, but the overall level of quality of the 39 issues or 41 issues of Unknown is just like astounding. We want to get Henry up here, but I just want to mention briefly, as closing out what I consider to be the Golden Age period. Now, some people, Garyn might be one of them, move the Golden Age into the digest era. November 1943 issue of Astounding was the last one in the pulp size. Or no, pardon me, October was. November was the first to go digest. My own view is that while there's some great stuff in the digests all through the 40s, I think that all the best stuff had been done. The markers that Campbell had laid down, that had all been done by 1943. What happened after that, in my opinion, was not as innovative. It was just more of the same. So we got a lot of great stuff. And I would just mention in that last year before he went digest, two really great stories are Fritz Lieber's Gathered Darkness and C.L. Moore's, help me out here,
Judgment Night?
Judgment Night. Yeah. Judgment Night. How do you feel about those as novels to close out the Golden Age?
Oh, they're excellent, both of them. The image that comes to my mind, and I wasn't here for the first couple pulp cons, I started in the 80s, but I'm not sure that Lieber didn't make one of the very early ones. He might have been a guest. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But the image I have of him is not only how talented he was and how fun his stories were, but how he, like Frank Belknap Long, ended their lives in kind of tragic, you know, the idea of Lieber sitting in his little apartment on his bed with an old manual typewriter, hacking out stories late into his years and that kind of stuff. And Catherine Moore could do no wrong as far as I was concerned. She was great. The one thing that, two things about Catherine Moore and Henry Kuttner, and Steve knows this, he's in and out. They purposely obscured a lot of who did what. And a lot of people like to claim that Catherine did more and Henry did more of the collaboration. It depended on the kind of story. And and the thing was about Henry, he was not far behind Max Brand for use of pseudonyms. And so he was a real benevolent, given guy. So he wrote under all kinds of pseudonyms. He helped other people out, young writers like Bradbury and that kind of stuff. And he didn't often ask for credit. So he's in more things than people realize, too. But, yeah, Catherine Moore, Judgment Night, you know, and then the nice hardcover with that wonderful cover that came out a few years after that. And that's great stuff. Fritz Leiber,
this is where you really see the flowering of literature. You see literature poking through the rough edges of science fiction, and you see big ideas. I think it's safe to say that Campbell was always fond of big ideas. Now, in later years, they kind of got the best of them, and some of them kind of ran away with them. But during the period that we've just been discussing here, 37 to 43, I really think it's the cream of Astounding. And those of you who read it, I'll leave you with one last point. When the first major anthology, hardcover anthology of science fiction, which remember, all during the 30s and 40s it was kind of regarded as a bastard genre, strictly a pulp genre, but when the first legitimate hardcover anthology came out, Adventures in Time and Space, almost all of the stories were not only from Astounding, but they were from this golden age that we've been speaking about. And that's another great book that's out. You can find that one probably in your local library. I know mine still has it. So in the interest of time and getting Henry up here, we're going to call it now. Garyn and I could go on all night about Astounding, but we're going to let Henry up here. He's got a Tarzan presentation, and then I'll be back here with a Tarzan presentation, which due to the lateness of the hour, I will condense, and we'll finish off the night's entertainment with a little Tarzan of the movies. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you later.